Todd Wolfson is an associate professor at Rutgers and is the vice president of the Rutgers Union, which has been a model, I think, for a lot of academic unions in terms of what it looks like to revitalize, to expand the scope of what trade unionism has often been considered. And so while I am extremely glad that we are not meeting with you while we are on strike, we as a committee were thinking about who are the unions that we look to as models for where we are growing into as we're taking on, I think, more political action where we are focusing more on becoming a member-driven union. And so we're really excited to hear from you, Todd. So thanks for joining us. And I know that we're on a very tight schedule tonight, which is great. So then everyone can do your other life things. And so we'll have a quick word and then we'll have conversation around that. But we will get everyone out of here by 8 o'clock. And so I guess if there's any other housekeeping things, someone should jump in, and otherwise I'm going to hand it over. With, again, really thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, I want to start out by saying thank you so much for inviting me. And I have to say, you all are an inspiration, being on strike for 7 friggin' weeks. That is amazing. We rarely in the US, and I imagine in Canada too, but we rarely see strikes of this length. So I mean, that takes immense organizing, and I hope tonight is a give and take, because I think we have a lot to learn from you all about that. So thank you. It's an honor to be here. I should say I'm on sabbatical. I'm not in, I usually live in Philadelphia, but I'm in Taos, New Mexico for the year. So thus the accoutrement. I should also say I have 3 kids, and I'm 1 hour behind you all, but I have 3 kids and they're crazy. This is not far from their bedtime, so who knows what will happen. So just want to throw that. And I also want to say a special thanks to David Canfield, who reached out to me for the invite. So thank you all. So, and one other thing before I get going, which is, this is great. And we have something like this called Freedom School, which is a monthly kind of educational. We invite folks in, and I think it's a really great way of bringing and developing political education among membership. So I just want to say we're thinking along the same lines around political education and events around political ed. So as Joe said, I'm current VP of Rutgers AAUP-AFT. I'm immediate past president of the union. We have about 8,000 members. That includes full-time faculty, grad workers, postdocs, and counselors at Rutgers, which, like I think University of Manitoba, is the state university of New Jersey. And so what I want to talk about is, from our union perspective, what we think are the strong elements of a union, or what we're trying to build out as we envision it. And I'll just say those really briefly. We think, obviously, I think we all believe the key is a strong department rep or steward infrastructure. You don't go anywhere without that at the center of your union, and strong democratic unionism that goes along with it, so that people are vested and bought into the mission of the union. Alongside that, from our vantage, what we've learned, certainly what I've learned over the last period, is that we need to shift gears away from a craft union approach towards a industrial or university-wide union approach, where we're breaking down the silos of job category and organizing across them. That's how we get powerful. And the last element that I'll flag, and I'll come back to these things, is what we call, and I don't know if this terminology is bled into Canada, but in the US we call it bargaining for the common good, which is when you use your contract to build and fight for initiatives that bring in community. So the contract becomes a leverage point to bring in demands that help you build a united front with communities around the university. So those are the 3 things. And I'm going to try to keep my stuff somewhat brief so we can have a back and forth. But before I do want to tell a story that offers context for how me, at least from my vantage, I got to these lessons. So I think we all know about that in the US and Canada, the UK, public higher ed's in crisis, a serious crisis. And I think we all know why. In the US, it's specific. There's been a long-term state and federal disinvestment in public higher education that's gone on over 50 years. And that led to the rise of these corporate neoliberal managers really taking over our institutions, and with all the bells and whistles that come with it. So prioritizing the bottom line of the university over the core mission of the university of teaching, research, and service, adjunctification, cheap short-term contracts that are precarious for teaching, but also for staff, rising tuition, and this is probably more a US problem than I think a Canada problem, but rising tuition and growing student debt. We are seeing it in terrible ways in the US. And then a massive growth of these university bureaucrats. We at Rutgers, the AAUP-AFT, like to call them vampires, but university bureaucrats, and then that tend to run our universities less like public institutions and more like businesses. And then finally, an attack on nation. But in the US, this has been the kind of like contours of the long-term crisis, which has been compounded by the acute crisis of the pandemic. Higher ed in the US, I believe, but I don't know, also in Canada, but in the US, higher ed was really severely impacted by the pandemic, and over 500,000 higher ed workers were laid off, or 14% of the sector writ large. And I was president of our union when the pandemic hit. And so I'd only been president for 6 months at that point, and it was a wake-up call, I'll tell you. I wasn't ready for it. But anyway, when the pandemic hit, we knew pretty quickly what the university was going to do, because they have a track record and we know who runs the university and we know the ideology that guides them. So we knew that they were going to try to ride out the pandemic on the backs of the most vulnerable. That's what they always have done historically, and that's what we knew they would do. And what that meant specifically was go after the most precarious workers, do layoffs and furloughs, et cetera. And so we wanted to get out in front of that. So we had good relations with the other universities on campus. And just to be clear, Rutgers is an organism of 100,000, 70,000 students, 30,000 workers. And the 30,000 workers, the large majority of you are unionized, but spread across like 19 unions. It's Byzantine, it's crazy, it makes no sense, but nonetheless, that's the structure. And so we knew what they were going to do. So we pulled together what's now called the Coalition of Rutgers Unions, and we put out an approach to the pandemic to kind of get out in front of what the university was going to do. We called it a people-centered approach. And our approach was organized around the concept of solidarity. So full-time, tenured faculty would sacrifice to safeguard the jobs of adjuncts and staff. That was the basic idea. And our demands were simple. Rutgers is a public university. It should be a beacon in a crisis. So here were the demands: no layoffs of our staff or our adjuncts, an extra year of funding for our grad workers, our PhD workers who haven't been able to move their doctoral studies forward because of the pandemic, support for international students. In the US context, we had the CARES Act, but the CARES Act wouldn't fund our international students. They got no support. So we wanted the university to put in specific support for international students, and then free COVID testing for the 3 communities around Rutgers. Rutgers is based in 3 major cities: Newark, New Brunswick, and Camden, and all of them are majority people of color. And we wanted Rutgers, which is also a part of a big medical system, to provide them free COVID testing. And in return for this, we would all workers would enter into what's called a work share program, which is like a modified furlough program. The difference is that because of the federal legislation and state legislation, everybody would be able to furlough, but get money back from the federal and state government, and it would keep them whole. So we would keep all workers whole, but we would save through this federal and state support, but we would make massive savings, over $100 million of savings for the university, as the university was crying that it was financially being squeezed by the pandemic. I'll say Rutgers actually made money during the pandemic, we now know, on the back end, but they, as all universities do, use a crisis to do all sorts of nasty things, and they were trying to use this crisis to do that. So So these were our demands, and the goal was to create this united front, all workers, students, and community fighting for a different vision of the university. We bargained for months, but ultimately the university rejected our proposal. They laid off 1,000 workers, disproportionately, over 1,000 actually, disproportionately women and people of color. It was focused on our low-wage workers, adjuncts, and low-wage staff. They stripped these folks of health care in the middle of the greatest health crisis we've ever lived in. And then they canceled all workers' raises. And what they did, their measures of dealing with the crisis saved them maybe $70 million, 60 or 70. So it was a lot less than the proposal we offered them, right? And the only thing we can surmise is that they rejected our offer because they were scared of the power of this growing coalition of all workers, students, and community. But we continued after that fighting. We had a massive action in the fall of 2020 that brought out students, community, and workers. We did a lot of political work, a lot of work actions, work slowdowns, and ultimately we forced the university back to the table. We also did political work with elected officials. We have forced the university back to the table. And then we won the deal in maybe March of, I guess, I don't even know, March of 20, maybe February of 21. So maybe 9 months ago now. And what we got were most of the things we were looking for: process for rehiring all the laid off workers, both adjunct and staff, a 1-year funded extension for all grad workers, job security, so no layoffs, committed through, I think, the end of this calendar year. So not for another month or so. Yeah, for another month or so. And everyone got their raises returned. And in return, we did this work share program where everyone was kept whole, but people furloughed. But out of that process, and particularly out of the solidarity that the faculty put forward, so the faculty could not be touched during the pandemic. They couldn't be laid off. They couldn't be forced into furlough. So, but the faculty agreed to furlough program in order to safeguard the jobs of adjunct faculty, so part-time faculty, and also staff. And so that kind of grand gesture isn't the right word, but that act of solidarity has built out a very powerful coalition that works together. We're going in, our contract all end at the end of June of this year, and we're planning to bargain as one coalition with the university, and we're fighting over how to get that done at this time. But it was this work during the pandemic that built out the possibility of a shared vision of how to move forward together. And so I guess I want to get to Q&A, but I'll say some of the kind of lessons we learned out of this, or at least I did, and I think are driving our union strategy moving forward. And I flagged them at the top. But the one lesson, I think, and we all know this, is that the people currently running our universities cannot run our universities. They do not understand the mission of higher education, nor do they understand the basic concept of a public good. They are running our universities into the ground, and that has to be stopped. So all the things we work towards have to ultimately drive towards a different vision of university governance. Second, in order to win, and I said this at the top, we have to have strong, organized infrastructure. So when we were going into this work, we sent, and I heard you all sent folks to McAlevey, one of McAlevey's schools, J. McAlevey schools. We sent 100 people to strike school. And I think it was a real kind of game changer for our department rep infrastructure. People got more committed, more focused. They learned really important lessons. And I think for us, most of our focus needs to always go into building out our rep infrastructure, training our reps, and holding our reps accountable to the work, right? You can't have, when you have a couple reps that aren't doing the work, aren't talking to their colleagues, it weakens the entire system. So it's really important to really focus on the department rep infrastructure. And then as another thing that we learned, I certainly learned, is that we have to stop the craft union approach. Our union has followed the craft union approach since it was established about 50 years ago, but it's not doing us any favors. We have to proceed with an industrial or university-wide approach to organizing, which means that we're building with and across staff unions, full-time and part-time faculty, grad workers, postdocs, groundskeepers. There can be, that has to be, from our vantage, the vision of the union, and we're stronger as one union. But there's a lot of work with, particularly with the more privileged faculty, in moving towards this sort of vision, because they lose some things. And so there's a lot of political education that has to go along with this. The next thing along with that, we have to build and develop campaigns that have the interests of our students central to them, or else we need, and it looks, I looked at your Twitter feed. I wish I could have been in Manitoba with you all, but I see that students came out for you. So it seems like you've already done this work, but it's also a lesson we've been trying to grapple with. How do we center students in our fights? Because we can't win without them. And then the last is that we need to build out with our communities. And this is this bargaining for common good language. And I want to stop talking and do more Q&A, so I can go into what that's looked like for us. But basically, we've partnered with community groups in the cities where Rutgers is based in. We've done surveys, and we've used those surveys to bring demand. So that was how we brought the free COVID testing demand. Then we brought, later we've been bringing demands to get all members of the communities to get vaccinated, and also an educational campaign to reach into those communities about vaccination. And we've won those things. And going into the next contract, we're going to make a demand around housing, a housing freeze. And I can explain why that's a BCG, or bargaining for common good demand. So those are the elements. The last element, the last thing I want to flag, and I said this as a first point, but I'll come back to it, is that strong contracts are just not enough. We need to fight over the governance of our institutions. And in the US, I don't know how University of Manitoba is governed, but in the US, we have this Byzantine structure where the governor of the state of New Jersey and the legislature, they appoint the board of governors that runs a university. And basically the last 3 people that were appointed are people that gave $10 million to the football team. They know nothing about higher ed, nor could they care less about it. All they want is their name to be able to say that they're on the BOG, the Board of Governors. And so we have to fight to take that back. At Rutgers, we're looking at what it would take to build a Rutgers Workers Council for all workers and maybe students. And so I'll end there, but I'm happy to talk about the questions of bargaining for the common good, or Workers Council, or a coalition through Q&A, but I'd much prefer to have some back and forth. Thank you.
Thank you. That's amazing. That's so much stuff. And I feel like we are going to have, I think, a lot of questions about how you got there. And also questions about where you go from there. I'm going to unspotlight you, and then I'll see if we have questions. Oh, let's see if I can figure out how to unspotlight you, actually. Okay, maybe I'm going to leave you spotlighted. Sorry. Any questions if folks have, or do you want me to start? I'll start. I am curious about how you got to the point where this is the model that you're working with. How do you move from, as you said, a place where it's hard to get the professoriate to give up some things to this place? How do you move toward like a really active, like organizing for power steward model? How do you move toward the bargaining for the common good? Because my understanding is that hasn't always been the culture. And so what did that look like, and how long did it take?
Yeah. I mean, it's been a process. There's still a lot of work we need to do. So for instance, I think we need to have open bargaining, but we're not there yet. We have different tendencies within the union, and not all those tendencies agree, right? And so it's a process, and all of this is a process. I'll say that we haven't had, we've had a series of presidents that have had different but increasingly shared understanding of what progressive unionism should look like. And so my direct predecessor is also my department colleague, and her name's Deepa Kumar. And Deepa really wanted to center the union on questions of equity and diversity. So we fought in our previous contract around making sure that the faculty at Rutgers mirror the New Jersey, which is a very diverse state, but the faculty aren't diverse. And so we had a campaign around diversifying our faculty. We had a equal pay for equal work campaign, which really pushed to make sure that women had the right to apply for equity adjustments if they could show that their male counterparts or people of color could show their white counterparts were being paid more. And so so those were like, that was an important step forward for the union. And then I think over the last couple of years, also the pandemic has just exposed the hollowness of the way the hollowness of the ideology of the people who manage our institutions. And so that has put people in motion, I think, in an honest way, and enabled or created an opening for us to step in and push for a more progressive vision for what unionism looks like, and a more militant vision, right? You don't want progressivism without militancy, right? We need to both organize our members and get them into step, and also make demands that are focused on reimagining what a university could mean, ending the contingency crisis, which is really bad at Rutgers, and centering students' needs and centering community needs while doing that. And so I can't say it's clean. We've had fights. There's been a lot of factionalism, and it's been hard. And I was just in a meeting trying to move our pharmacy faculty into closer alliance, because our pharmacy faculty are not, they're the STEM in general and pharmacy in particular are not super aligned. And when I met with them, they were like, well, I don't know what you really expect from us. All you really care about are grad workers and community members. You don't care about tenured faculty, right? And that's not true, right? We always center the needs. We have our bread and butter demands, but there's a feeling. So it's a process, and it's not a clean process. It would be crazy to think it is.
Sounds somewhat familiar. I got a question in the chat. Can you describe what a craft union is, and how it's different than the model that you're working with?
Yeah, I sure can. And I can't see the chat, so forgive me, but just want to flag that. So what I'm saying, those are like old terms, and we could just throw out the terms. But what I mean by it simply is organizing by job category versus organizing by the entire system, right? And so we could have a model where tenured faculty are in one union, adjunct faculty are in another union, postdocs are in another union, grad workers are in another union, administrative staff are in another union, and groundskeepers and dining staff are in their own separate unions. And there's all these silos. And to be honest, at Rutgers, and I bet at Manitoba, we've inherited those silos. It's not like we can just stop having those separate unions. But I think that approach where I'm only fighting for my needs of my job category is an approach that makes us much weaker. And so craft unionism, by that, what we mean is the craft, meaning the type of job you have, versus a sector-wide unionism, which means you build a vision that includes everybody. And so in the case of Rutgers, it would mean we're fighting and building a vision and bringing demands that center all of the workers, not just faculty. I hope that's clear, but that's the kind of divide I'm trying to flag.
And so you're timing your bargaining, but are you bargaining the same contract, or you all have separate scopes and separate contracts that you're timed together and have a commitment to then not moving forward until everybody's alongside?
It's the latter. I mean, so we're fighting to get to, there's all these legal infrastructures, and we have a very bad labor regime. I imagine Canada's legal labor regime is better. Ours is pretty bad. But so we are merging a couple units into one union. That's what we're working on right now, going into the contract campaign. But then we have an agreement with 18 of the 19 coalition unions that we will bargain together, and we're going to have a memorandum that no one leaves the table till we all have our contracts complete. And there's a history of bad stuff where the faculty union, which is mine, which is the strongest, has gotten its stuff and then agreed to its terms. And then the less strong unions have been out in the wind. And there's been a lot of angst there. And so we're trying to stop that and also say, okay, well, if the key demand of the administrative staff is a telecommuting policy, then we're going to fight for that telecommuting policy like it impacts us. And we're not going to leave the table till they win it.
Eric, you look like you have a question.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks so much. This is really interesting. I was just wondering, I mean, New Jersey's a democratic state, but deeply, deeply regionalized, and one where lots of the local areas, I mean, Camden and Newark, have always been hard to develop support from the surrounding communities. There's lots. Are you able to move from community support to a broader sort of, across the state appeal, and how does that work, sort of playing the political structure as well as the community-based structure?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and you're right about the regional specificities of the state.
I grew up in Murray Hill, so
there you go. Yeah. So the way Rutgers is structured as a university, we have our biggest campus in New Brunswick by far. 70% of faculty and students are in New Brunswick, 20% in Newark, and 10% in Camden. And New Brunswick also happens to be the smallest of the three cities. So where we're strongest with the community is in New Brunswick. And New Brunswick is, I'd say, majority undocumented, majority Spanish speaking. It's a growing majority. And so we've made a lot of strides in building with mostly labor and community organizations that represent this large undocumented community. A group called New Labor, which works with temp workers and day laborers, which are, I don't know if those are terms that have any meaning in Canada. And another group called Cosecha, which mostly focuses on immigrants' rights. And so we're still developing our bargaining for common good strategy. But I'll give you an example of where we're at. So we did a survey. We stipended both a community member coming out of one of these organizations I flagged and an undergraduate student. And for the summer, they went out and knocked on doors in New Brunswick, and they did like a 10-minute survey with community members. And then out of that survey, I think we did like 300 surveys total. So it wasn't huge. We ended up doing an analysis, and we tried to find out what the core issues were. And the core issues that unite our student population and our community population are, you would guess it, it's not hard, but low wage work, lack of good healthcare, and high rents. And so we've stepped back and said, what can we do in bargaining that would actually focus on some of these things and bring the community towards us, so that when we're fighting at the bargaining table, if we have an open bargaining session, there's 50 community members alongside us. And so we're going to focus on a rent freeze. Rutgers doesn't own all of the housing in New Brunswick, but it owns about 30 to 40% of the market. So if it stabilizes rent, it will impact the entire market, and then therefore the large undocumented community that doesn't rent from Rutgers. But at the same time, it will also impact our undergrads who have these shitty little dorms that they're paying far too much for, and our international students who are coming in and getting sold these these bad packages. And so we're going to make this demand. It's going to be the first time, other than the pandemic, when we made this COVID testing demand, that will actually bring a demand that came from the community to the bargaining table and use our contract as a way to win it. To the other part of your question about how you move from the regional to the state, it's extremely complicated. We're still trying to figure some of that out. I mean, we have some big statewide labor partners that we're working with that are progressive. The Communication Workers of America has most of the public sector workers in New Jersey, and they're very progressive. So we're aligning ourselves with them and a bunch of community groups, and we're trying to think about what our set of shared demands around a wealth tax. And we actually won, and we're part of winning a millionaire's tax in New Jersey about a year or two ago. So those are the sorts of things we're thinking about at the state level. But frankly, for us at this point, we lose our power the bigger we get at this point. So when we're making state demands, we don't have nearly the same kind of power than when we're making our regional demands. That said, we know we have to fight there. So when I was talking about the governance of our university, we're not going to win the governance of our university in a contract fight alone. We're going to have to win it legislatively at the state level, for instance. So we know we have to get there. We don't have that. We frankly don't have that power yet.
Thanks.
there questions or things that people are thinking through as you're thinking about what it would look like if we did this kind of thing? Carol?
Sorry, I'm just a whole bunch of things are scooting through my head, trying to compare what's going on at Rutgers and what you're able to accomplish with what we can do. Like we're a much smaller faculty union. Obviously, we're 1,200 people. Our university that we support is 30,000 students, and we've got what 1,400 in instructors. I think that's the number. Is that right? In another union in QP, and we've got another few unions on campus. So with our faculty, and this is coming from my perspective, so everyone else out there, this is a librarian looking at faculty as a whole. So feel free to shoot me down. That'd be great. I think with our union, we are so focused on looking inwards on what our work environment looks like, that turning outwards is like turning a massive ship on a dime. It's conceptually, it's a hard thought. I think something that the OCC, the Organizing and Communications Committee, is trying to do is to organize around performance-based funding. And trying to battle that in our state, in our province, against performance-based funding in post-secondary education. So that's one thing we see kind of coming down the pipe that we could use to galvanize our union and think about, looking outside. But what I'm hearing from you that I find really interesting is that community aspect and how to engage all the other unions on campus and really start using some, like, I'm thinking numbers, Eric. We had a huge, I think for us, one of the most committed strikes we've had in our history. So people are interested and looking, but we could be using some of that to leverage. We have ACES, the largest support staff union on campus, has been without a contract for 2.5 years. And maybe that's one of the things that we could have included in there. We have to, we respect ACES and we want to bring them to the table too. You've got to get their contracts sorted out. And maybe that's a missed opportunity, but it's something that I don't think we've ever thought about before. So how do you take that and switch it around and start focusing more outwards? How do you convince people that that's a good direction to go in? What are the key things that you think were kind of like the linchpins in that process for you?
Yeah, that's the real question, particularly with the more privileged parts of the university system, which are tenured faculty, right? They have the most to lose in a bigger coalition vision. So there's the most work to do with that part of your membership. At least that's how I saw it. And so, but I will say this, I mean, so we as a union convinced our faculty who didn't have to furlough to stop the job, to demand a hiring back process for adjunct faculty. I guess your equivalent of lecturers, is that right? And also for staff. And we couldn't. I don't think you can only send a message of solidarity. I don't think that would work, right? So what we had to do was pair a bread and butter demand with a solidarity demand in order to move them into a position where they were ready to sacrifice. And the bread and butter demand here was, you're going to get your raise back. Now, if I'm being honest, I think our unit could have fought and got our raise back alone. We could have done it. But the argument we made to our membership was, the way we're going to create the university we need is to commit to this work share program. We will get you your raises back. And in the process, we will also fight to make sure staff and adjunct faculty and grad workers are getting their needs met because they're more precarious. And so we were able to win that argument. But I don't think we would have won it if we didn't have something in it that was meaningful for faculty. And I'll say again, so we almost agreed to an extension with the university of all the unions for 1 year because we had just finished pandemic bargaining and we were going into contract bargaining right after that, and we were all exhausted. And we had convinced our local, which is the most highly paid, that we would all get a lump. So we had negotiated a 3.5% raise with the university, and we would take it as a lump sum and spread it out as a dollar amount to staff, grad workers, adjunct faculty, and our faculty, which means that the professors who are making a lot of money, say $150,000 to $200,000, were taking their raise and spreading it out into the staff, into a different unit. And we were able to win that argument internally. But we ended up not being able to sign the deal for a whole bunch of other reasons that the university pulled some other bullshit. But so I think, now I'll tell you the truth. Every time we make one of these moves, we lose 20 members. It's not like we don't bleed some, but I think we're stronger still in the end. So I don't know. I think there's a political education component to this. There is a solidarity component, but there has to be a bread and butter component, or else it just doesn't make sense. But now the other thing I'll say is we don't have a large membership town hall where we're not putting a union leader from the staff or the adjunct union or the medical union in front of them, so that our members aren't starting to see and build a relational feeling towards the other parts of the university.
Eric?
Sorry, my cursor got lost there. Yeah, I guess I wanted to ask a sort of skeptical question, and a question you mentioned early on, and we know there's the attacks on tenure in Georgia and South Carolina that has passed or has introduced a bill rolling back tenure, and the old sort of craft union model of the U.S. faculty union had as sort of its central mission. I mean, if you look at the AAUP, the first thing they mention is academic freedom concerns, shared governance, professional values, the old classic thing of a craft union. Given the probability of a further rolling attack on both governance issues, but also straight up, academic freedom, the withering away of tenure, are there risks in moving away from that older model of craft unionism when attacked with academic freedom issues? And I mean, I don't know how it works in a state where there's a lot of different options of universities, a much larger private university system. But do you have any sense of how do you have defense for academic freedom in the community too? And how might you build those values and make those alliances?
Yeah, I mean, so we are in, I'll say this because you flagged it earlier. We are in a state that's very insulated because we are in a very blue state. And so we're going to be one of the last public universities that faces a tenure attack or an academic freedom attack. And the reason I flagged that is because we haven't strategized around this very important question because of the privilege of being in, I mean, it's not like New Jersey politics are healthy, but it's a blue state. So whatever you want to make of that, they're not, if anything, we're getting our governor and our legislature are moving forward policies that strengthen our hand at the moment. But that said, I think the point you're raising is a critical one, which is solidarity has to be a multi-directional street. Right. You can't build a bargaining for common good strategy or a union coalition strategy across job category where one part is only sacrificing for the other parts. That's not, it can't work that way. It has to be a thing where multiple groups are fighting together for multiple things. And if we end up in a place, and this is a danger, we're not there yet, but you're right, it's a complete danger. If we end up being in a place where the faculty union is fighting to make sure that the undocumented population in New Brunswick has housing they can afford, we fight to make sure that there's a tuition freeze for our undergrads, and we fight for something important for our grad workers and something important for our adjuncts. and staff, and we don't have them fighting for whether it's academic freedom or the strengthening of governance in our departments, or good raises, or a better sabbatical structure, or better maternity and paternity leave. Who knows? I don't know, but we could imagine. If we don't have those things and they aren't willing to go to bat for them, or better academic freedom. So we're seeing all sorts of weird stuff with academic freedom on social media sites going on, right? But if they're not willing to fight for those things, then it can't work. It won't work. And we will end up being out on a precipice, well outside the kind of role of the union, and we will end up getting crushed. I think that's clear. And so I think in all of this work, there has to be a very careful process of political education. And also, or again, and this is something that Joe flagged in her question, organizing. Like, we're nowhere, and a democratic infrastructure where members at the roots see a reflection of their needs, desires, visions in the work of the union. It has to stay, that has to happen. So, and I say that, humbly, because there's no way we would be able to pull off a 7-week strike right now. No way. So I say that saying it to you, you just did something that's mind-blowing from my vantage.
I think part of what I think about for Eric's question is, like, the way that you build power is by building power. And if we want to have, sorry, I also have a little one screaming or talking. The way that we build power is in fighting these other fights. And then we have power that we can use and spend and grow and exercise when we get into those academic freedom fights, which I think are coming here and potentially a lot faster than some other places, right? But like, we don't have the power to fight those back right now. But like, the way that we build that power is through these coalitions. It is through like doing the kind of work that I think we're moving toward with political campaigns. And I don't mean that as like NDP. I mean that as like exercising power, showing that membership will turn out, like, doing the kind of relationship building across issues that have traditionally not been seen as, like, again, craft unions or even unions. And so I think expanding our scope so that we have some actual power that we can bring to the fight is part of the strategy too. We're gonna get close to time soon, so I want to encourage people, if you have a question that you are like maybe on the fence about, you should ask it, because this is I think a pretty cool opportunity, and I think we'll have more opportunities to talk with these folks and other folks about how they have moved union culture. And so I just want to encourage people to like either put it in the chat or jump up. Okay, great, Simone.
Yeah, thanks so much for this great presentation. My question just has to do with the fact that I have missed a short part of your presentation, which is where you explained to us what in fact made in the end your bargaining suggestion become successful. So how did you get the other side to agree to it? This I didn't get.
Yeah, I mean, we had a 3-track campaign. Or maybe 4. We had a bunch of, we weren't ready to go on strike. It was the middle of the pandemic. We weren't prepared for a strike, but instead we had a bunch of work actions. Our librarians in many ways led the way. Carol, just to flag, and we're fantastic. So there were a bunch of work actions in our library system, work slowdowns. We had a bunch of really big rallies. I mean, in the midst of a pandemic, I think we had a 500 or 700 person rally in New Brunswick that brought together a set of community demands, student demands, and worker demands. So one track was work actions and political kind of events. A second track was we worked our elected officials really hard. And we made the simple argument that Rutgers was out of step with the quote blue state, and it is. Rutgers leadership it all comes out of, and I'm getting into New Jersey politics, so maybe Eric will get this, but all come out of the Chris Christie regime, right? And Chris Christie was like this real super right-wing governor. And so Rutgers is run by all those folks. And so we basically worked the political angle that Rutgers was out of step with the state and got the governor to weigh in very heavily on this. We had a very strong media strategy. So we had a worker militant strategy, which included strike actions and others, not strike actions, worker actions and other sorts of events. We had a political strategy and we had a media strategy. And the other thing is we had a new president. So one of the reasons Rutgers was in such a tailspin is in the middle of the pandemic, they changed presidents. And so the new president is, I'm not going to get into how I feel about him. We don't like each other, but what I will say about him is that he is really burnishing his reputation. And so he saw his role as president of Rutgers to be a public figure. And so he was really susceptible to reputational damage. And so we went after his weak spot and went after his reputation, and it worked. So those things were what we did, and that forced them back to the table and forced them into a deal that they didn't want to make, that they didn't make 9 months prior. And yeah, there's one other piece that I'll flag, and this comes out of like our vision, and we're in the process of doing this right now. So which is this question about structure tests, which Joe just flagged for me, which I would love to talk about, which is that we structure tested ourselves throughout the pandemic, but it was very hard to get a good sense of our structure because there was nothing face-to-face, right? And so we had no classes, no physical geographic kind of density. And so it was a really weird and hard time to do it. We took a survey to ask people if they were ready to take structure. Oh, go ahead.
I don't think everyone knows what a structure test is.
I'm so sorry. So a structure test is something you do as a union to understand to take the temperature of your membership to see where they're at, and to see how willing they are to take further militant action. It comes out of Jay McAlevey. And so during any campaign, and again, during any campaign for us, we have a set of escalating events which help us understand where our membership's at and whether they're ready to take the next step, right? And so they can be all sorts of things, like ask your members to wear a red pin on Wednesday, right? And you see how many people do that, or how many people open your emails. That's not a really good one, but it's a soft one, right? Or how many people are taking your surveys. But then the serious structure tests are how many people are willing to vote for a strike authorization, how many people are then willing to put their name out publicly on a strike authorization vote, right? And then that lets you know whether you can have the kind of strike you want to have, which you all must have done in one way or the other. So it's a way of testing how strong you are. And we have done it. We had trouble doing it throughout the pandemic. And now we're going into a contract campaign, and we're beginning a process of structure testing ourselves through that campaign. The first one was we wanted to get a survey about what people's demands were going into our next contract. And we wanted to get 4,000 people to fill out the survey. And we wanted to really force our department reps to do the work, which wasn't just sending out an email saying, hey, please take the survey, but actually calling each person in their department and saying, you need to take the survey, or setting up a meeting for the department where everyone took the survey together. And so that was a test for us going into this contract campaign about where we're at. And then it let us know, okay, well, these 20 departments, we have a lot of work to do. These 30 departments are really good, and these 50 others are somewhere in between, that kind of thing. And so that's part of a culture of our organizing, which is you always want to know where you're at and how strong you're at, so you can know what sort of action you're going to be able to take.
Excellent. We have 2 more questions, and I know you only have 7 minutes. So Annette, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, and I'll just say sorry for not putting my camera on, but it's been a really long day. So I decided that I wanted to listen to you, and thank you very much for coming. Lots of really good ideas that are just forming in my head. But one thing that really stood out for me when you were talking, So I'm also a part of OCC, which has been a lovely group of people to hang out with during this strike. We looked a little bit at the Board of Governors at one point, and so I never really looked at the Board of Governors before, even though I'm a full professor here, and I've obviously been around for a while, but I was kind of blown away. Out of the 24 people I think that are on there, over half of them are basically, they are there because they've been appointed by our provincial government. So when you mentioned about developing, and I don't remember the words you used, but a different level or having some influence on that, I would be very interested to hear more about that, because if we can't influence there, I think that's a place where we need to be able to sort of open some space to be able to have influence on where things go. Thank you.
Thank you, Annette. And I get it, long days sometimes. I get the feeling. I'll tell you where we're at, which is, as I said earlier, we can get really strong, but labor law in the US sucks. And so contracts that we fight over, there's a real sort of like wall, and there's some things we just can't bargain over, right? And I'm sure that's the case with Canada, although I imagine the law is more permissive. And so when I'm looking at what's the real crisis in higher ed, what I think is the real crisis is who governs our institutions, and that can't be dealt with purely in our contracts. And so alongside that, so we have to fight over governance. There's no way forward in the long term. If we're going to end the crisis in higher ed, public higher ed, we have to fight over who governs. And we have to make sure that workers and students have a critical seat at the table. I don't see another way forward. And so in New Jersey, we have the similar thing, except that the state government, the provincial government, the equivalent, and the legislature, they appoint everyone. The governor appoints half and the legislature appoints half, more or less. And their appointments are political favors for the rich and wealthy, right? So 90% of the people are sitting on the board of a corporation or are coming out of business. None of them have any experience in higher education in the way that faculty and students do, or the vested interest in it. So where we're at is we're studying other models. And there's two things in particular we're looking at right now. One is the way some South American universities are governed, like UNAM, which is in Mexico City, which is an autonomous university. The faculty elect 5 or 10 people to the board of governors. The students elect 5 or 10 people. The alumni elect 5 or 10 people. The staff elect 5 or 10 people. And those folks govern the institution. They hire the president. They set the budget. And so that's one model we're looking at. And then the other model are the works councils in like North Europe. And in those models, there's like co-governance. And so we're looking at both of these things. We're going to develop a model, and then we're going to, in our next contract, not the one that's up in a year, but the one that's would be up in 5 years, because our contracts tend to be 4 years long. We hope to have a demand that all the unions bring around a workers' council that is then married to a political or legislative fight for a change in governance, administrative governance. So it would be a contract fight and a political fight that we would marry in order to start to shift this. We're not going to win it all at once. It would be a process. But again, we have to stop having accountants and lawyers and other bureaucrats running our institutions. It's killing us.
Yeah, very cool. Thanks for sharing that.
Okay, the last question, which I'm hoping you can answer very quickly given our time, is regarding the industrial conception of unions. Do you have any ties? Or are you looking to build stronger ties with larger federations of labor, to like the AFL?
Yes, I mean, that's a really complex question here in the States, and I imagine it's complex in Canada too. Our national unions, we're mostly AFT. We're also AAUP, to Eric's point earlier. We're a mixture of the two. So we're so AFT is the largest AFL-CIO union at this point, 1.7 million. So we're part of that. And there are certain unions that are more sympathetic to an industrial model of organizing, like UAW, the auto workers, because they come out of that sort of model. The national unions, have a bunch of boundaries, right? And so those boundaries play out at the national level, and then they transmit them to us at the local level. So it's hard for us to sort of like push back at those boundaries. But some unions are better than others at the national level, and there are better and worse alliances. So it's a complex field, I could say. But yes, we can't do this without support from our national unions, but they're not, what their vantage on this at the national level and the interests they have are not always aligned with our vantage at the local level. And so there's complexities and conflicts that emerge from that. So yes, but I guess would be the answer.
Okay. Well, I'm looking at the time and we promised to get everyone out of here at 8 o'clock. And so I just want to take the last minute to again, thank you, Todd. I feel like this was really energizing, especially after the last month or 100 years of being on strike. It's really fun to think about the possibilities and to hear what other folks are doing and to think about this work as being like a much broader project. And so I hope that we will continue to be in relationship. I wish that we could go like out for drinks afterwards. I feel like that would be really good to hear all the backstory on this stuff. And so maybe we can arrange for that another time. But thank you. And thank you to everyone who has joined us tonight. It's great. Again, I'm going to push the Organizing and Communications Committee is where a lot of these conversations are happening to figure out what does it look like to build member-driven unions. What does it look like to think about organizing for the social good, for the common good over the long haul? Because this is not the end, this is very much the beginning for us. And so thank you. I'm getting lots of thank you messages in the chat. And I hope that I will see everyone on the next one of these things, which probably won't be until the new year. So